Welcome to American Outlaws Tube, where every week we will bring you stories of some of the most daring criminals this country has seen. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now sit back, grab some popcorn, and enjoy a trip into history with American Outlaws Tube. It's the waning years of the 18th century, and America is still finding its footing after the Revolutionary War ended in 1783. Along the winding Mississippi River and the perilous Natchez Trace, where merchant flatboats drift through lawless territory, a name begins to echo in hushed whispers: Sam Mason. Samuel Mason, born around 1750, likely in the colony of Virginia, rose from the ranks of a militia captain who served during the Revolutionary War to become one of the most notorious outlaws on the American frontier. He found fertile ground for banditry in places like Cave and Rock along the Ohio River in present-day Illinois, and on the rough trails near Natchez in what was then known as the Mississippi Territory. Operating from the mid-1790s to the early 1800s, Mason and his gang of river pirates and highwaymen capitalized on the booming river trade, waylaying travelers, stealing cargo, and leaving behind a trail of fear. By 1803, Mason's criminal reign would meet its inevitable end, but not before his name was etched into frontier lore forever. In this documentary, we'll journey through the violent and uncertain world of the post-revolution frontier. We'll uncover how Sam Mason's life of crime began, trace the growth of his network of outlaws, and delve into the dramatic events that sealed his fate. Welcome to a forgotten corner of American history and the legend of Sam Mason. The year is 1790, and America is still recovering from the ravages of the Revolutionary War. While the fledgling nation has secured its independence, the frontier remains wild and unpredictable, a place where lawlessness and opportunity coexist. As settlers push westward, stretching the limits of civilization, vast territories open up for trade, exploration, and most of all, exploitation. The Mississippi River, the lifeblood of commerce and transport in the early United States, snakes its way through this rugged land. It's along its banks and on the roadways like the Natchez Trace, an ancient trail connecting the Mississippi Territory to Nashville, that many would encounter their doom. Stretching some 440 miles through what are now the states of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama, the Natchez Trace was once a vital route for travelers and traders moving between Natchez, Mississippi, and Nashville, Tennessee. The road, however, was perilous. Remote, poorly patrolled, and often ignored by authorities, it became a hotbed for highwaymen, outlaws, and bandits. To many, it was a road best avoided, a place where danger lay just beyond the next bend. The waters of the Mississippi weren't much safer. By the 1790s, flatboats carrying goods, livestock, and settlers became prime targets for criminal gangs. The flatboats, slow-moving and vulnerable, would make their way downriver from Pittsburgh, carrying everything from furs to whiskey, and occasionally, passengers. Outlaws like Sam Mason preyed on these boats, lying in wait along the riverbanks or ambushing travelers on the roads. Mason's criminal activities were centered in strategic locations like Cave and Rock, an infamous outlaw hideout along the Ohio River, near present-day Hardin County, Illinois. From here, he commanded a gang that terrorized the waterways. By the time Mason came into prominence, the frontier was a volatile mix of new settlements, former soldiers, opportunistic traders, and settlers trying to carve out a life from an unforgiving land. With limited law enforcement, few stable institutions, and vast stretches of untamed wilderness, the Mississippi Territory became a breeding ground for criminals who, like Sam Mason, used their knowledge of the land and their brutal methods to prey on unsuspecting travelers. It was in this lawless environment that Sam Mason would come to embody the very essence of frontier banditry. His story is the tale of how a nation's expansion can give rise to its darkest figures, and how the absence of order can breed an outlaw legend. Samuel Mason was born around 1750, likely in Virginia, a colony that was both a place of opportunity and hardship. Not much is known about his early life, and much of what we have is based on conjecture and sparse records. What is certain, however, is that Mason came of age in an era marked by conflict, an era that would shape his future, and perhaps his violent tendencies. Mason's first foray into violence and leadership likely came during the French and Indian War, 1754-1763. Like many young men of his time, Mason enlisted in the colonial militias, drawn into the conflict as tensions flared between the British and French empires in North America. It was during this war that he gained experience in combat, military strategy, and the tough, unforgiving environment of frontier warfare. While there's no definitive record of Mason's specific service, it's likely he fought in the Ohio River Valley or along the Great Lakes, regions where skirmishes were frequent. These battles would have introduced him to the brutal realities of frontier combat, skills that would serve him well once the war ended. When the French and Indian War ended in 1763, many former soldiers, including Mason, found themselves facing a difficult new reality. The promises of land and security never materialized, and the unsettled frontier was plagued with economic instability and conflict. The transition from soldier to civilian was not an easy one. For some, like Mason, the lessons learned in war may have planted the seeds of lawlessness. The next chapter of Sam Mason's life came during the American Revolutionary War, 1775-1783. By this time, the former militiaman was in his 30s, and his experience in the earlier conflict made him a natural choice for military service. He served as a captain in the Virginia militia, a rank that spoke to both his military acumen and leadership abilities. During the Revolutionary War, Mason fought alongside fellow Virginians, taking part in several key engagements against British forces and their loyalist allies. His service likely took him through the Mid-Atlantic region, where the fight for independence raged the fiercest. But like many soldiers, Mason's service was often marked by a blend of heroism and disillusionment, gaining skills while facing the brutal realities of war. When the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, America was left in a fragile state. The new nation was still finding its footing, and veterans like Mason returned to a country struggling with debt, political instability, and a lack of opportunity. While many soldiers returned home to farm or rebuild their lives, others, like Mason, found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. The frontier, still teeming with unsettled lands and shifting borders, offered a different kind of opportunity and a different kind of war. Like many of his peers, Mason found himself drawn to the lawless lands of the Mississippi Territory, a region where authority was sparse and the rules of civilization barely existed. And it was here, in the chaos of this expanding frontier, that Sam Mason's darker inclinations would emerge. After the war, Sam Mason, like many veterans, faced the harsh realities of a nation in flux. While the country celebrated its hard-fought independence, the frontier, particularly the Mississippi Territory, remained a place where the old rules of society didn't always apply. By the late 1790s, lawlessness was becoming more rampant, and the stage was set for men like Mason to exploit the power vacuum. The Mississippi River, the lifeblood of commerce in the region, was teeming with trade, but the lawless conditions made it a perfect target for those looking to exploit its vulnerabilities. Flatboats filled with goods from the northern settlements floated downstream, bound for places like New Orleans. These boats were slow-moving, vulnerable to ambush, and often carried valuable cargo, from furs and tobacco to rum and firearms. Mason, having seen the chaos of war and the instability of the frontier firsthand, understood that power in this new land wasn't held by governments or laws, but by those who controlled the routes and the resources. By the late 1790s, Mason was already establishing himself as a leader among a group of criminals who would come to dominate the Mississippi River region. His operations centered around Cave-in Rock, a natural limestone cave along the Ohio River in present-day Hardin County, Illinois. The cave served as both a hideout and a base of operations for Mason and his gang. Its remote location, deep within dense forests and bluffs, provided a perfect hideaway for those looking to escape the law. The area around Cave-in Rock was notorious for being a haven for outlaws, thieves, and river pirates. The cave itself had long been used by criminals and bandits, going back to the 1790s, when it became a focal point for a growing network of criminals who specialized in ambushing flatboats and attacking traders. Mason and his gang weren't alone in their criminal enterprise. Many other outlaws, including the infamous Harpy brothers, operated in the same region, engaging in raids and plunder. As Mason's influence grew, so did his gang. The river itself became his domain, where his men would lie in wait, attacking unsuspecting boats laden with goods. His group became well known for its ruthlessness, using force to overpower victims and steal their cargo. The thefts weren't just limited to the river. Mason's gang also targeted travelers on the Natchez Trace and other critical trade routes. It's said that many who ventured into this wild land never made it to their destination. The outlaws, including Mason, would take anything of value from their victims: money, weapons, supplies, and sometimes even their lives. Tales of Mason's cruelty, including reports of his men scalping victims and burning their bodies, spread quickly, making his name feared throughout the region. His gang was not just about robbery, it was about control. For Sam Mason, the frontier was a place where only the strongest survived, and those who resisted could be eliminated without hesitation. As Mason's operations grew bolder, so did the response from local authorities. But the frontier was vast, and law enforcement was spread thin. While some militias and bounty hunters were sent to deal with the river pirates, the sheer remoteness of the region made it difficult for the authorities to catch Mason and his gang. Even when they were pursued, Mason and his men knew the land better than anyone else, often managing to slip away into the wilderness before a pursuit could even begin. Mason was adept at using the land to his advantage. Whether it was the labyrinthine waterways or the dense forests of the Mississippi Territory, Mason's gang knew how to vanish, only to reappear when it suited them. And with each successful heist, Mason's reputation grew, both among his peers as a leader and among the general public as a figure to be feared. For nearly a decade, Sam Mason would continue to terrorize the region. His gang grew more organized, and their attacks became more audacious. By the time Mason's name became widely known, his criminal empire was operating across multiple states, from Tennessee to Illinois, with territories extending along the Mississippi River, the Natchez Trace, and even further west. The world of Sam Mason was one populated by criminals, each driven by the same forces: greed, survival, and a complete disregard for the rules of the fledgling American Republic. In the untamed frontier, Mason wasn't alone. His criminal exploits were part of a larger network of outlaws who thrived on the lawlessness of the Mississippi Territory and its surrounding regions. But while Mason was ruthless, he wasn't just a lone predator. He had both allies and rivals. The region surrounding Cave-in Rock, where Mason based much of his operations, was a haven for outlaws, including some of the most infamous figures of the early 19th century. It wasn't long before Mason became associated with a network of criminals operating along the rivers, trade routes, and frontier settlements. His gang became one of the most notorious in the region, but they weren't the only players in this game of violence and theft. Among Mason's most notorious contemporaries were the Harpy brothers, Micajah and William, two of the most bloodthirsty and savage criminals in frontier history. Operating in the same territories as Mason, the Harps were known for their brutal killings, including the scalping and dismemberment of their victims. They were so feared that their name became synonymous with terror across the frontier. Mason and the Harpies, however, were not always allies. In fact, their relationship was marked by tension and occasional rivalry. Both groups competed for the same resources: cattle, goods, and territory. While they sometimes cooperated in raids or shared information, their mutual distrust was always simmering beneath the surface. This rivalry would eventually come to a head, leading to bloody feuds between the two gangs. One of Mason's key allies was his trusted lieutenant, a man named James Jim McFarlane, a fellow outlaw who helped Mason command his operations. Together, they would plan and execute daring raids along the Mississippi River and the Natchez Trace. McFarlane, known for his cunning and ruthless demeanor, was instrumental in the organization of Mason's gang, and his loyalty helped solidify Mason's control over the region. But as Mason's criminal empire grew, so did his need to expand his influence. He formed alliances with other outlaws, traders, and sometimes even corrupt local officials, making it increasingly difficult for the authorities to stop his operations. It was not uncommon for Mason's men to work with local traders who turned a blind eye to their activities, or even with militia members who were willing to take bribes in exchange for information. These connections allowed Mason's gang to operate with near impunity for years. The line between law and crime in the frontier was often blurred, and Mason exploited this corruption to build his criminal empire. However, despite these alliances, his growing reputation and violent tactics also made him plenty of enemies. Lawmen, territorial militias, and even bounty hunters were not the only ones who sought to end Mason's reign of terror. His violent ways earned him enemies among rival outlaws and even former associates. Mason's disregard for human life and his constant need to expand his territory led to multiple betrayals within his own ranks. At times, Mason's own men would turn against him, either for a bigger share of the loot or simply because of disagreements over leadership. Tensions between gang members led to splits within the group, creating more chaos and violence. It was a constant battle, not just against the authorities, but also against those closest to him. Despite these internal conflicts, Mason's gang remained formidable, and his alliances, however tenuous, allowed him to survive longer than many of his contemporaries. But in the wild and unforgiving frontier, alliances could be as volatile as the violence that defined it, and even the most powerful criminals had to watch their backs. Despite his reign of terror, Sam Mason was not beyond the reach of the law. For years, local authorities and militias made repeated efforts to capture him and dismantle his criminal empire. But in the lawless expanse of the Mississippi Territory and the wilderness along the Ohio River, enforcement was slow and often ineffective. The very terrain that had helped Mason build his empire was the same terrain that made him nearly impossible to catch. Lawmen, bounty hunters, and even hired mercenaries were sent to capture Mason and his gang. But the vast and unforgiving landscape worked in the outlaws' favor. With the Mississippi River and the Natchez Trace as key routes for trade and travel, Mason knew the terrain intimately. This allowed him and his men to evade capture time and time again, slipping away into the dense forests and remote caves where they could lie low until the authorities lost interest. One of the most notable attempts to capture Mason came in 1803, when local militias, spurred on by the rising number of raids on travelers, launched a concerted effort to dismantle his gang. At the time, the federal government had little direct control over the Western territories, and local authorities were often the first line of defense against outlaws like Mason. A large-scale operation was initiated to hunt down Mason and his gang. A militia force, supported by bounty hunters, began systematically scouring the area around Cave and Rock, where Mason was believed to be hiding. They raided several known outlaw hideouts and questioned locals, but Mason was always one step ahead. He used his knowledge of the land to avoid capture, relying on his fast horses and well-hidden caves to stay out of sight. Cave in Rock itself was a perfect sanctuary. The cave, with its hidden entrances and natural fortifications, allowed Mason and his men to remain out of sight, even when the law came knocking. The sheer isolation of the region made it nearly impossible to maintain any sustained law enforcement presence. And when the militia would raid a suspected hideout, Mason and his men would often scatter into the surrounding wilderness, only to regroup later and continue their raids. The Mississippi River, a crucial artery for trade, also proved to be a lifeline for Mason. The river itself was constantly moving, with flatboats and barges drifting downstream. Mason's gang was known to strike when the river traffic was at its peak, when there were few options for escape, and the outlaws could quickly disappear into the current, blending into the flow of traffic. One of Mason's most daring escapes took place during an ambush by law enforcement on a riverboat he was raiding. As the militia closed in, Mason and his gang made a quick getaway, commandeering another boat and blending in with the river traffic. For every attempt the law made to stop him, Mason found a way to slip through their fingers, an elusive ghost in the wilds of the frontier. This game of cat and mouse played out for years, with Mason continuously evading capture. Despite multiple arrests and attempts at trial, Mason's gang was notorious for breaking out of jails or disappearing before they could be convicted. The frontier's lack of organized law enforcement and the rampant corruption in some areas only made their capture more difficult. Through it all, Mason remained a figure of resilience and defiance. For over a decade, he and his gang haunted the waterways, robbing, terrorizing, and slipping away from the law. His name became synonymous with danger, but also with cunning. He was a product of a frontier that had yet to be tamed, where the strong survived, and the rules of civilization were little more than suggestions. But the endless pursuit of Mason would eventually wear thin. The authorities' resources were limited, and public sentiment started to turn. People were beginning to tire of the constant terror Mason and his gang instilled in the region. And soon, his crimes would catch up with him, though not in the way anyone expected. Though Sam Mason's reign of terror seemed unending, all empires, criminal or otherwise, eventually faced their downfall. For Mason, that inevitable end came not through the hands of lawmen, nor through the endless manhunts he'd eluded for so many years, but from an unexpected source: betrayal. The betrayal came in 1803, when Mason's gang was already beginning to splinter under internal tensions. It was during this time that Mason became acquainted with a man named John McNeil, a former associate who would play a pivotal role in his downfall. McNeil, who had once been a trusted member of Mason's gang, was reportedly disgruntled. As Mason's operations continued to grow, some of his men began to feel marginalized, and McNeil, seeing an opportunity to escape his violent past, made a decision that would seal Mason's fate. McNeil, turning coat, offered to lead local law enforcement to Mason's hideout in exchange for a reward. The authorities, eager to capture the notorious outlaw, seized the opportunity. It was a treacherous move that sealed Mason's fate, and in a cruel twist, it was someone who had once ridden alongside him who would bring about his capture. With McNeil's information, lawmen were able to track Mason to his hideout along the Ohio River. However, by the time the authorities arrived, Mason and his gang had already slipped away, once again, evading capture. Yet McNeil's betrayal was the beginning of the end. It was only a matter of time before Mason's luck ran out, and the net would close in on him. In 1806, with law enforcement and bounty hunters closing in, Mason's gang was becoming more paranoid and increasingly fractured. The pressure was mounting, and Mason's usual cunning was failing him. In a fateful encounter, Mason's gang was ambushed by a combined force of local militia and bounty hunters near the town of Harrisonville, Missouri. The trap had been set. The gunfight that ensued was bloody. Mason's men, caught off guard, fought back fiercely, but they were outnumbered. In the chaos, Mason managed to flee into the surrounding wilderness. His escape, however, would be short-lived. He was severely wounded during the battle, and his ability to move quickly and evade capture was diminished. Severely injured, Mason had nowhere to run. He sought shelter in the dense forest, hiding from his pursuers, but his body was betraying him. In his weakened state, Mason couldn't go far. His injuries, combined with the sheer exhaustion from years of evasion, took their toll. It's said that Mason's final days were spent alone. A once feared outlaw, now a hunted man, barely able to move. In a twist of fate, it was a bounty hunter named William Williams who would finally bring Mason to justice. Tracking the fugitive to his hiding place in the wilderness, Williams found Mason, cornered and near death. Some accounts say that Mason tried to resist capture, while others claim he surrendered quietly, knowing his time had come. Whatever happened in those final moments, Sam Mason was captured alive and brought to Harrisonville for trial. The once feared river pirate and outlaw was now a prisoner, shackled and awaiting justice. Sam Mason's trial was swift. The crimes he committed, robbery, murder, and terrorizing entire regions, were unforgivable. But what happened next was a sign of just how far his life had unraveled. On the morning of August 15, 1806, Sam Mason was sentenced to death. At the gallows, Sam Mason was executed by hanging, bringing an end to one of the most notorious outlaw careers of the early 19th century. His death marked the end of an era of river piracy and frontier lawlessness that had dominated the region for nearly a decade. Though his life ended in betrayal and violence, the legacy of his crimes lived on. Sam Mason's story serves as a reminder of the brutal reality of the American frontier, a place where lawlessness reigned, and men like Mason were products of a world where survival came at any cost. His death may have marked the end of his criminal empire, but his name would endure as a symbol of the untamed wilderness that birthed him. Though Sam Mason's death marked the end of his criminal reign, his legacy, like the wide Mississippi River, would flow through history, leaving an indelible mark on the frontier that helped shape the early United States. For many, Mason embodied the harsh, violent nature of the wilderness, the lawless land where only the strongest and most cunning survived. His story was immortalized in the annals of American outlaw history, becoming the stuff of legend. His name became synonymous with river piracy, violence, and rebellion against the fledgling government's authority. For decades after his death, his story would be told in taverns, on riverboats, and in the campfires of settlers and travelers who feared the unknown wilderness. Mason's criminal activities contributed to a growing awareness of the dangers along the Mississippi River and the surrounding territories. His reign of terror and the subsequent efforts to bring him to justice highlighted the weaknesses in the government's ability to enforce laws in the frontier regions. In many ways, Mason's criminal career was a catalyst for the eventual push for greater law enforcement in the Western Territories. The piracy on the Mississippi River, which Mason and his contemporaries had fueled, would eventually decline as law enforcement became more organized, and the United States government began to assert more control over its territories. However, the legacy of the river pirates lived on in folklore, in the stories of those who survived the violence, and in the reputation of the region as a dangerous, untamed frontier. Today, places like Cave in Rock, once a notorious hideout for Mason and his gang, have become historical landmarks, attracting curious tourists interested in the wild days of river piracy. The legacy of Sam Mason still lingers in these places, his name carved into the very landscape, a reminder of a time when the law was but a distant notion. While Sam Mason's story may no longer inspire fear, it serves as a powerful piece of history, illustrating the struggle between civilization and lawlessness, and the complex realities of frontier life. His tale is a testament to the grit and determination of those who lived and died by their own rules in a land still finding its identity. Today, Sam Mason's name is immortalized not just as a criminal, but as a part of America's wild history, an outlaw whose exploits captured the imagination of the public. His story serves as a reflection of a turbulent period in American history, where the frontier was a place of opportunity for some and lawlessness for others. And as long as his legend endures, the figure of Sam Mason will remain a symbol of the rugged, untamed wilderness that helped shape the nation. Sam Mason's name may have been lost to time in some circles, but his legacy lives on in the stories passed down through generations. Stories of crime, survival, betrayal, and the fierce pursuit of freedom in the unforgiving wilderness of America's frontier.